Good morning. I'm Michael Dalto with High Note Consulting, and welcome to a webinar on HUD rental assistance programs. So, we'll be talking about programs funded by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I tried to think of an appropriate story to start it. I don't know any urban development stories, but I do know this one about housing. My grandmother used to tell this years ago. Um, Her father, my great grandfather, for whom I was named, was a coal miner in Pennsylvania, and he and his family lived with his mother-in-law in her house, which was right next to the mines. And his mother-in-law would get him to do tasks around the house. And one day she said, "Mike, you've got to clean out the outhouse. It's full." And as you can imagine, this was not his most favorite task. And my grandmother said he just kind of sat around for about an hour, just thinking. And then he started wandering around the outhouse and he was kind of wandering over to the mine. And it seemed like he was sort of scoping things out somehow, calculating. And finally, he walked into town and went to the hardware store. And he came back home with a stick of dynamite in his back pocket. And he gathered his three children, including my grandmother, together, and he sat them on a bench about 50 yards from the outhouse and said, "Watch this." He walked over to the outhouse. He pulled out the stick with dynamite, lit a match, lit the fuse, dropped the dynamite down the hole, and ran. And my grandmother said the explosion lifted the outhouse a few inches off its foundation and it settled a little crooked. And when the smoke finally cleared, they all went over and they looked down the hole and saw nothing. My grandfather explained to them that he had figured out that the outhouse was situated right above an old abandoned mining tunnel. And the explosion had blown the hole all the way through to this gigantic empty space. And my grandfather never had to clean out the outhouse again. So I'm kind of glad to be named after somebody that resourceful. But anyway, so lucky for my grandfather, he was not getting HUD rental assistance, or he probably would have been evicted. But we're going to be talking about HUD rental assistance programs today, not because they are state-specific benefits, but because the national training and certification for benefits planners, the trainers will be the first ones to tell you they don't have adequate time to cover HUD rental assistance programs. So we're going to do that today. And just like with the SNAP module, for those of you who attended a couple weeks ago, this one also has an Excel sheet that lets you estimate the impact of earnings and other changes on the amount a family has to pay for rent and utilities when they're using a HUD rental assistance program. So our objectives are to consider the purpose of HUD rental assistance programs, look at the three main kinds of programs that HUD offers, to identify work incentives in the HUD programs. There's actually only one left. We'll talk about that. To use the HUD rent calculator to estimate the rent and utility amounts that an individual or their family needs to pay, given their circumstances. We'll be looking at how something called flat rents, an option for public housing, and a certain rule regarding housing choice vouchers, one of the programs we'll be looking at, can be used to protect eligibility for rental assistance when family income increases to the point where they might otherwise lose that rental assistance. And throughout, we're going to be talking about key changes to HUD rules that have been made or are in the process of being made through a federal law called the Housing Opportunities Through Modernization Act, known as HOTMA for short. And before we go any farther, I just wanted to let you know I will pause for questions, but please, if you've got something burning that you want to say, please go ahead and take yourself off mute. I won't be looking at the chat except periodically. I will break frequently though for questions. Um, so if you would really like to add something or ask something, and get an immediate response, please, you're welcome to do that. But if you can come off mute and say it aloud, that would be helpful. So I love the idea of HUD rental assistance programs, of which there are actually many. We're only going to be talking about a handful during the training. But there's a one of the documents that I emailed you yesterday is a comparison of about 16 different rental assistance programs. Um, and almost all of them are funded by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. A couple are funded, believe it or not, by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but they provide lots of details about a wide variety of programs beyond the scope of what we'll be talking about during today's PowerPoint. But what I love about these programs is that they're based on the principle that housing should be affordable and that an individual or a family should be paying generally a percentage of their income for their rent and utilities. And it's fair that if their income goes up, their share of the rent and utility payments would go up. But the flip side is also true. If their income goes down, maybe because somebody lost their job or had their hours cut, or somebody left the household or died and their income went with them, then the amount that the family needs to pay for rent and utilities for their share also goes down, which is a really nice feature when you think about what happens to most people who are renting if their income goes down. They still have to come up with the full rent. Otherwise, they're going to be evicted. So, tenants in HUD rental assistance programs pay a percentage of their income for rent and utilities. But that percentage is not going to be the full amount of their rent and utility costs. So HUD funds are used to make up the difference. And HUD funds all of these programs, so it's a federal agency, but the programs are administered at the local level by agencies known as public housing agencies or public housing authorities. So they're administering the programs at the local level using HUD rules and HUD funds. Although HUD does give public housing agencies some flexibility to tailor their programs somewhat. Um, some rules must be followed or are mandatory for all public housing agencies or PHAs for short. But other rules, the PHAs have flexibility about how they'll actually run their programs. So there are three main types of HUD rental assistance programs, and they are public housing, project-based Section 8, and housing choice voucher, which is also sometimes called Section 8 voucher or tenant-based Section 8. And the main difference among those three types of programs is where the individual or family needs to live in order to get the rental assistance. So, public housing is housing projects that are owned and operated by the PHA. And in public housing, the individual or the family must be living in the public housing project in order to get the rental assistance. If they move out, they lose the rental assistance. Now, there's an income limit to get into public housing initially. You have to have low income, which HUD rules define as 80% of the area median income. And this is something kind of new and interesting about HUD programs compared to other benefits that we deal with. Usually, with other benefits we deal with, there are income limits, specific income limits. They may be based on percentages of federal poverty or other dollar amounts, but they usually apply everywhere the program operates. That's different with HUD programs where the income limits are based on percentages of the area median income. A median is somewhat similar to an average, but a bit different. Um, a median is the dollar amount above which and below which there are an equal number of people or families who have that level of income. So if in a particular jurisdiction where a PHA operates, it's usually a county or a city, they will determine what's the area median income for that area. And obviously, in wealthy areas, the area median income is going to be much higher than in poorer counties or cities. And 80% of that area median income is considered low income. But what might be low income in a wealthy county is going to be a lot higher than what would be considered low income in a poorer county. So for public housing, although there's an upper income limit of 80% of the area median, the low income level, 40% of families that are being newly admitted to public housing have to have extremely low income, which means income only up to 30% of the area median. The next type of HUD rental assistance we look at is called project-based Section 8. So this is different from public housing because it involves housing projects that are owned and operated by private owners rather than by the PHA. So that's a key difference. But like public, excuse me, like public housing, project-based Section 8, an individual or a family must live in that housing project to get rental assistance. And if they move out, they lose the rental assistance. So families that have project-based Section 8 must have very low income, which HUD defines as up to 50% of the area median. Although with some older housing projects, the income can be up to 80% of the area median, the low income level. But these are very old housing projects that started operating before October of 1981. Now, like public housing, 40% of newly admitted families have to have extremely low income, only up to 30% of the area median. And finally, there's the housing choice voucher or Section 8 voucher. And this is very different from public housing and project-based Section 8. And the main difference is with a housing choice voucher, an individual or a family can live in privately owned rental units and they can move. They are not required to stay in one housing project. They can live in pretty much any private housing that is owned by a landlord who is willing to participate in the Housing Choice Voucher program. And the vouchers are actually portable. They're mostly used in the area where the PHA is located, where the individual or family starts out. And that's mainly because, people tend to want to stay in the area where they have friends and family and connections and employment and amenities. But technically, the vouchers are portable and can be used not just in the county or the city where the person started out. They can be moved, they can be ported, is the term that HUD uses, anywhere in the US. Now, that can be a challenge. Sometimes there are waiting lists to be able to move, but the vouchers are portable. You're not stuck living in a particular housing project. Um, and a tenant family or an individual who has a housing choice voucher has to have very low income rather than low income. And again, very low income means up to 50% of the area median. But 75% of the vouchers that are newly distributed each year have to go to families with extremely low incomes, only up to 30% of the area median, compared to only 40% of newly admitted families to public housing and project-based Section 8. So housing choice voucher has a big advantage. It's portable. You can live in any private unit where the landlord's willing to participate in the housing choice voucher, but the income limits are lower, significantly lower for housing choice voucher. Now, finally, there's something called project-based voucher, which is not necessarily a good deal for tenants, for families that participate, but it can be a good administrative option for PHAs. Let's say that a PHA has jurisdiction over certain public housing or project-based Section 8, and there are a lot of vacancies in that housing project, and the PHA wants to fill them to make it uh, efficient for the PHA or the private project owner to operate. So what they're allowed to do is the PHA is allowed to take up to 20% of their housing choice vouchers, which, as you know, are portable, and they can designate those as being usable for at least a year only in a particular housing project so that they can help fill those vacancies in that project. And when they convert a regular housing choice voucher to a voucher that can only be used for at least a year for a particular housing project, it becomes what they call a project-based voucher. But after the family or individual have lived in that housing project for at least a year, they can then move out and they can request that they get a regular housing choice voucher rather than a project-based voucher. But for at least a year, the first year that they're living in that housing project, they must stay in the housing project. If they move out, they will lose their voucher and their rental assistance. So, just a quick reminder about what low income, very low income, and extremely low income mean by HUD's definition. So low income is up to 80% of the area median income. Very low income is up to 50%, and extremely low income is up to 30% of the area median. So how do you find out what these income limits are for a particular area, particular county or city that you work with? Well, on slide 10, you'll see a link to a HUD webpage that lists these area median incomes and the various percentages of them, 80, 50, and 30%, for all of the areas that are served by PHAs throughout the US. Okay, I'm going to pause for a moment, see if anybody has any questions or comments. Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Anybody want to ask a question or make a comment verbally? Okay, then I'll keep going. So there are some key points regarding all of these HUD rental assistance programs. First, family, and incidentally, different benefits refer to the group of people whose finances are considered and whose numbers are considered when determining eligibility with different terms. Often it's referred to as a household or an assistance unit. HUD always calls that group of people a family, even if they're not all necessarily related by blood or marriage or adoption. And a family could even be a single person living alone in a HUD rental assistance program. So the share of the rent and utilities that the family pays is called the total tenant payment. So that's the share they pay. And remember, what they're not paying, HUD funds are being used to pay through the PHA, which administers them. And generally, the family's share of the rent and utilities, their total tenant payment, is going to be 30% of the family's adjusted monthly income. And that's usually going to pay for their rent, including utilities. And if they're paying for utilities separately, they get something called a utility allowance, which we'll be looking at a bit later. So 30% of adjusted income is generally what the family will be paying as their total tenant payment. But if the amount is greater than 30% of their monthly adjusted income, they could be paying a different amount. And that could be 10% of their gross monthly income, which is rare. You'll rarely.
Oh man.
Okay, Gustavo, I think you're off mute. Go ahead and mute you. Um, so that would be rare. It would be only generally if a family has, very low income and a high amount of deductions from income in the HUD calculation. I am not sure I've ever encountered it. Um, if the family is receiving some type of welfare assistance and there's a specific amount designated for housing that's more than 30% of their adjusted income, then that's what they would pay. I don't believe that's the case in New York. I think any welfare assistance does not have a designated amount to pay for rent and utilities. And then finally, there's an amount called the minimum rent for certain programs. So there's certain programs where even if the family has virtually no income, there isn't a dollar amount that's set as the minimum income. So even if 30% of the family's monthly adjusted income is less than the minimum rent, they're generally required to pay at least the minimum. But the minimum rent is very low. It's usually $25 or $50 a month. And if the family has real hardship, maybe they have no income currently, they can get an exception to minimum rent and don't have to pay even that amount. But generally, 30% of adjusted income is what the family is going to pay. And that's what the HUD rent calculator that you'll be using is based on. Now, there is an exception when a family may be paying more than 30% of their adjusted income for rent and utilities. Um, Even if the 10% of gross income, the welfare assistance payment designated for housing, or the minimum rent are not an issue. And the exception applies in some cases to the housing choice voucher. And here's how it works. When a family has a housing choice voucher and they choose a unit to rent, and usually they've got only I think maybe 90 days to find a unit to rent when they get a housing choice voucher. So they really need to hustle to find a unit that they like where the landlord is willing to participate and accept their housing choice voucher. So say the family finds a unit they want to rent, and the PHA establishes what's known as a payment standard for units of that type. So it might be, this they've got a big chart of payment standards for one bedroom, two bedroom, three bedroom, et cetera, uh, for, a certain number of people living there, um, that sort of thing in a particular area. And they've got these big charts that say, okay, well, a unit of this kind in this community should have a moderate rent amount of X, and X is called the payment standard. Now, if a family uses their housing choice voucher to rent a unit where the total rent and utilities are at or below the payment standard, then they'll pay 30% of their adjusted income for rent and utilities. But suppose the family finds a unit with a total rent, a market rent, that's greater than the payment standard. HUD rules allow them to go ahead and rent that unit anyway. But there are limits. First of all, what the family needs to do is they have to pay their usual 30% of adjusted income for rent and utilities, plus they have to pay the difference between the payment standard and the market rent for the unit that they're renting. So let's say that a family chooses a unit with a, a gross rent, market rent, including utilities, of $1,100 a month. And let's say that the payment standard for that unit is $1,000 a month. So the unit they picked exceeds the payment standard by $100 a month. That family would have to pay for rent and utilities 30% of their adjusted income plus an extra $100 a month, the amount by which their unit's rent exceeds the payment standard. Okay. But when the family first rents a unit, they cannot be paying more than 40% of their adjusted income. So the PHA will look at, okay, here's 30% of your adjusted income. And if you rent this unit, you're going to have to be paying the extra. In the example we just used, the extra $100 a month. But then the PHA looks at the total that the family would be paying, 30% of their adjusted income plus $100 in this example. And they figure out, okay, what percentage of adjusted income would that total payment be that the family had to make to rent that unit? And the total payment that they need to make, 30% of their adjusted income plus the difference, cannot be more than 40% of their adjusted income. Okay, so if they want to rent a unit and it's got a rent that's higher than the payment standard, and the total that they would have to pay to rent that unit is more than 40% of their adjusted income, the PHA will tell them, sorry, That's too expensive. You need to find a more affordable unit to rent. Okay. Now, on the other hand, if a family rents a unit with their housing choice voucher, and then later their landlord increases their rent, they are actually allowed to stay in that unit and pay even more than 40% of their adjusted income if they want to. But of course, they do have the option to move because the housing choice voucher is portable. So, some more key points. Um, when determining income eligibility for all of these programs, income of all household members, all family members, as HUD calls them, except for live-in aides and people, adults or children in foster care in the home, um, income for everybody else is counted. So, income of a live-in aide for a person with a disability or adults or children getting foster care within the household, um, their income is not counted and they're not considered part of the household. So if utilities are not included in rent, if the family is paying for at least some utilities separately from their rent, then what the PHA does is they assign a utility allowance. And this is in order to make things administratively more feasible and less onerous for the PHA. If the PHA had to determine for each rental unit the actual amount that the family was paying for utilities month to month or even year to year, it would be a huge administrative headache. So instead, the PHAs determine what they call utility allowances. And they've got big charts for this too. And the utility allowance says, okay, for a unit of such and such size with such and such many people living in it, and paying for such and such utilities, we think that a moderate, reasonable amount for that family to pay for those utilities is X. And X is going to be the utility allowance. And that amount gets deducted in the rent calculation. So if a family has a payment, or excuse me, a utility allowance of $150 a month, $150 a month is going to be subtracted from the amount that they would be paying for rent and utilities. And what's left, generally 30% of their adjusted income minus the utility allowance is the actual rent that they'll pay to the landlord. Now, if the family has a utility allowance of $150 a month and they're very frugal with their utilities and they only pay $120 a month for their utilities, they're going to come out ahead. On the other hand, if they use a bit more utilities, let's say they're spending $180 a month on their utilities rather than 150, they're going to be losing out a bit. They'll be paying more than 30% of their adjusted income for rent and utilities because of their utility usage. Okay. All right. So, quick question for you. And you can go ahead and type an answer into the chat. A family that receives HUD funded rental assistance will never pay more than 30% of their adjusted income for rent and utilities. And if you can just please type true or false into the chat, it would be great. All right, very good. Everybody is saying false, which means you're awake. Excellent. That is false. We know that in certain circumstances, a family may be paying more than 30% of their adjusted income, such as if they have a housing choice voucher and they rent a unit with gross rent higher than the payment standard, or if, say, 10% of their gross income is higher than 30% of their adjusted income. Now, this law that has made some changes already and is in the process of making more changes, it's a pretty big law, big federal law, is called the Housing Opportunities through Modernization Act, or HOTMA for short. And HOTMA regulations finally took effect on January 1st of 2024. The law was actually signed, to give you an idea how old this was, it was actually signed by President Obama in 2014. It took close to 10 years before the regulations finally took effect. And even though the regulations took effect, and even though originally HUD said that each local public housing agency, each PHA, had to implement all the rules by January 1st of 2025. They backed off that. I think the PHAs pushed back against it and said, we need more time. And so there are some rules that are going to be implemented as of July 1st this year. Some PHAs may have already implemented them. So July 1st is a deadline. It's not a set date by which the changes will take effect. So some PHAs may have made some of those changes already. And then there are other changes that HUD has said can't yet be implemented by the PHAs because of administrative issues. And so they haven't yet set a deadline for some of these provisions as of yesterday. I don't think that's going to change anytime right away. So, I apologize for not being able to tell you, okay, these are when all the changes under HOTMA are taking effect. Um, some have already taken effect. Some may have taken effect within certain PHAs, but not yet with others that may be waiting until July 1st. And then other changes, we have no idea when they'll be taking effect because HUD is saying the PHAs aren't even allowed to make them yet. So it's kind of crazy making. And I didn't try to tell you specifically which changes have which deadlines because they may change it again. But I did want you to know that the different changes are taking effect at different times, and may differ even from one PHA to the next. So, one of the changes that already took effect, and this took effect December 31st of 2023, was the elimination of a work incentive called the Earned Income Disregard Disallowance, or I just call it the Earned Income Disregard. And this was canceled by HOTMA, except for families that had already started using this work incentive before January 1st of 2024. So if a family started using this work incentive by or before December 31st of 2023, then they would be allowed to finish using it. But no family could start using it as of January 1st, 2024. So what the earned income disregard did was when an adult generally started new employment, rather than having the family's rent increase right away based on this increase in income, the increase in rent would be phased in over time. The first 12 consecutive months, the rent wouldn't go up at all as a result of the new employment earnings. The second 12 consecutive months, the rent would be increased, but only half as much as if all of the increased income from this employment were counted in the calculation. After the 24 consecutive months, then the usual increase would begin. The entire earnings would be factored into the calculation, and the family would have to pay that rent. So this was canceled as of January 1st, 2024, unless the family started using the rule before January 1st of 2024. Now, when I first heard about this rule being canceled, I was upset and I thought, oh, this really stinks. This is really hurting people. But since then, I have had a change of heart, and I'll tell you why. I don't think that this is such a bad thing. I mean, I think the reason that they canceled it was that it was a challenge for the PHAs to administer, and they lobbied to have it canceled. But here's why I don't think it's such a bad thing to have it canceled. When the earned income disregard existed, here's what typically happened. Say an adult in the household and the family would go to work, and instead of the rent and utilities increasing right away, the rent would not increase at all for the first 12 months. So what happens in a situation like that? The family's income increases, their rent does not increase under the earned income disregard for the first 12 months. What do families typically do in a situation like that? Especially if they've got low income, they spend all the money they've got on living expenses. So the family would get used to living on their new income amount with their old original rent amount. After 12 months, their rent would increase. So now they're used to spending all their income, and now this rent goes up, and it's a real hardship. Then another year goes by, and then their increases again. And they may not have had any further increase in income. And now they've got to adjust to having yet another rent increase without extra income to offset it. Okay. And I think that it's probably better if a family has this new income from employment come into the home and their rent immediately increases. Remember, it's only generally going to increase by 30% of the adjusted income. So the family is still comes out way ahead, 70% ahead, basically. Um, and then they're going to be used to living on the income that they'll have in the longer term because they'll be living with the rent that's already been increased. Okay. So this rule was eliminated, but only people who were using it as of December 31st, 2023 could continue using it, and it's 24 consecutive months. And that means that the latest possible date that the earned income disregard can be used by anybody will be December 31st, 2025. And that's only if they started using the earned income disregard the last possible day, namely December 31st, 2023. So there are probably extremely few, if any, people that you'll work with who are still using the earned income disregard because of that narrow window of when they had to start using it. Now, there is another work incentive called the Family Self-Sufficiency Program that's existed for a long time, and it will continue. It has continued under HATMA and will continue indefinitely. And not terribly long ago, HUD actually changed the rules for the Family Self-Sufficiency Program to make it apply to more kinds of rental assistance and to be a bit more generous. So it now applies to public housing, the housing choice voucher, project-based voucher, and project-based rental assistance tenants. And that's better than the old rules where it only applied to public housing and the housing choice voucher. So the Family Self-Sufficiency Program is, as the name suggests, designed to increase a family's self-sufficiency economically. And to accomplish that goal, the program, it's known as FSS for short, provides case management and an escrow fund to tenant families to help them reach a plan to be more self-sufficient, generally through employment. And they can get education, job training, counseling, childcare, financial coaching, transportation aid, in order to help them reach this goal to be more self-sufficient through employment. So, what's the escrow fund? What does that mean? Well, with the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, if the head of household under FSS goes to work or has their earnings increase, the family's rent does go up, but the amount of the rent increase that is not just kept by the PHA to administer the program. That increased rent goes into a special account called an escrow fund that's designated for that family. And once the family reaches their goal, they can get all of the funds that are in their escrow account, and they can use those funds for expenses to be more self-sufficient. Now, generally, the family has to reach their goal before they get the funds in the escrow account. But HUD realized, well, in some cases, the family may need some of those funds in order to complete some of the steps in their plan to reach their self-sufficiency goal. So they do allow the PHA to release some of the funds in the escrow fund if necessary before the goal is reached, but only for purposes that will help the family reach the goal. So there has to be a designated head of the FSS family. Used to be the case that that had to be considered the head of household for rental assistance purposes. Now it could be somebody else. So you might have, the head of household be an adult, like head of the family, living in the unit, and the head of the FSS family might be one of their adult children who's living in the home. So the FSS can last for up to 5 years after the first recertification that follows the FSS start date. What does that mean? Well, if the family starts the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, let's say today on May 28th, 2025, and at least once a year, the family has to go through a recertification, a redetermination of their eligibility and the amount that they need to pay for rent and utilities. So let's say their next recertification is 5 months from now, the end of October. That will start the 5-year clock ticking. Late October, whenever they get that recertification, will be day one. And then they'd have 5 years after that date to complete their FSS goal, meaning they actually get a bit more than 5 years. It's 5 years plus whatever waiting time there is between when they join the FSS program and they get their next recertification. Now, the 5-year limit can be extended for good cause for up to 2 years. And in order for the family to be considered to have reached their goal, they have to be free of cash welfare assistance at the time that they reach their goal or they graduate from the FSS program. And welfare assistance is generally going to be the temporary assistance program or the special needs, excuse me, the SNA program, FA or family assistance uh, or SNA, um, special needs assistance. I, I'm blanking on the acronym. But anyway, those are the two programs that would generally be considered welfare assistance in the state of New York. Um, so this slide 22 is a bit confusing, and I'm just going to say that basically the amount of the rent increase when the head of the FSS household goes to work or increases their earnings, the rent increase is what goes into the escrow fund. Okay, and I've already talked about the content on slide 23. Um, Slide 24 is really no longer relevant. This applied when a family might be able to use the earned income disregard and the family self-sufficiency program at the same time. This will no longer happen. Next question for you. HOTMA eliminated the earned income disregard disallowance and the family self-sufficiency program. True or false? You can type it into the chat. Okay, very good. This one is false. Most of you said. Um, it was only the earned income disregard that was eliminated. The family self-sufficiency program has continued, and it has actually been improved as well. So, you know that the amount that a family has to pay for their share of the rent and utilities, the total tenant payment, is based on a percentage of their adjusted income, generally 30%. So, what kinds of income count? Which kinds don't count? This is the really boring part of this webinar. I'm going to go through it rather quickly. You're not going to remember this, but you know where to look up this information. And at the very end, I've got a few slides that give you the actual HUD sources that I use to develop this training. And if you ever need to look up information on a HUD source, um, that that's where you want to rely on. If you need to argue with a PHA, for example, rather than this PowerPoint. So, most types of income are counted when figuring a family's adjusted income and 30% of that. And that includes means tested benefits like SSI. So SSI does not count as income for a variety of public benefits we work with, but it does count as income for HUD rental assistance programs. SSI also counts as income for SNAP, as you know. Um, but there are a number of types of income that are not counted. First one I want to mention is earnings of children who are under age 18, unless they are the head of household or the spouse of the head of household. I have not encountered a situation where a child under 18 was either the head of household or the spouse of the head of household. So any children under age 18 who are living in the household, part of the family, any earnings they have from work, okay, that's his only work earnings, are not counted as income in the HUD rent calculation. Now, if the children have other kinds of income, like SSI or child support, that will count. It's only the work income of the child that does not count, and the child has to be under age 18. The rules were a bit more, were similar, but a bit more restrictive with SNAP, you may recall. With SNAP, earnings of a child under age 18 were not counted, but only if they were a student attending school at least half time and living with a responsible adult, a parent or another adult. But with HUD, it's any child under age 18, any work income they have does not count. Okay. SNAP and other food assistance programs don't count. Earned income tax credits and other tax refunds. If a family member is using a plan to achieve self-support or PASS, which is an SSI work incentive some of you are familiar with, the PASS expenses are deducted from their income. Um, Income received in certain job training programs, reimbursement for expenses incurred during participation in certain public programs, um, reimbursements for medical expenses. If a family lives in a housing project and they can get what are known as resident service stipends for doing chores around the housing project, the amount of a stipend that they get for chores around the project, the resident service stipend up to $200 a month is not counted. Although if they get more than $200 a month, the entire amount does count. Personal needs allowance for people in certain uh, ICFs, intermediate care facilities for people with intellectual developmental disabilities. You do have a lot of these in New York. And personal needs allowance for people in assisted living units. Um, so one-time withdrawals from certain retirement funds, namely IRAs and 401k plans, don't count as income. If there's a full-time student who is age 18 or older, the first $480 a year of their earnings from work will be excluded from income. And HOTMA will be adjusting that $480 a year amount for inflation annually. Lump sum benefits, back pay that people get from SSI, Social Security Disability, or payments from the VA, the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, don't count as income. Um, Here's another key. People always ask me, well, what if a family member is getting a public benefit, but amounts are being withheld from it to pay back an overpayment? Do they count the total amount of the benefit before the withheld amount to repay the overpayment, or the net after the amount was taken out to recover the overpayment? And it's the latter. They subtract the amount that was withheld to repay the overpayment. They don't count that as income. They only count the net benefit that the person gets. So payments that are received for providing foster care for children or adults don't count. Adoption assistance payments, the amount over $480 a year is not counted. Funds that are paid by a state agency to a family to offset the costs of caring for a family member with a disability living in the home. certain amounts of long-term care insurance payments. Um, lump sum payments for, we talked about lump sum back pay for certain benefits, also lump sum payments for things like inheritance, insurance settlements, capital gains. Those also don't count as income. Income of a live-in aid. I referred to this kind of briefly and quickly earlier, that a live-in aid who's living in the home solely as a convenience to care for a person with a disability there does not count as a family member, and their income doesn't count either. Um, Most forms of student financial aid don't count. Special payments to members of the armed forces who are exposed to hostile fire, funds received through HUD training programs, proceeds from a loan. Loans don't generally count as income because they have to be repaid. And then HUD, under the new HOTMA rules, will also be excluding some additional kinds of income. Funds in ABLE accounts, including interest or dividends earned on the money in the ABLE account, doesn't count as income. There are certain provisions involving trusts. Um, if a member of a family is the beneficiary for a trust, whether it's irrevocable or revocable, but it's not controlled by a member of the family living in the unit, withdrawals from the principal of that trust do not count as income, but withdrawals of the income on the trust, the interest or dividends that's earned on the money, would count as income. Now, with an exception, though, withdrawals from the income of an irrevocable trust, that's a trust that can't be canceled out, um, that are not controlled by a family member and that are used to pay for medical expenses of a minor in the family, that does not count as income either. So it's a rather specific and maybe confusing rule. So what might be an example of an irrevocable trust not controlled by a family member? That could be a special needs trust. Many of you are familiar with these trusts that are set up to benefit a person with a disability, but they don't own the money, they don't control it. Another party known as the trustee controls the money. The money can only be used to benefit the person with the disability, but they don't control it. So that would be an example of this kind of trust. Um, Malpractice or other settlements for actions that cause the disability of a family member, not counted as income. Income of people getting foster care in the home don't count. Income from funds in college savings plans. Income from family self-sufficiency accounts. So family's been paying the increased rent when the family self-sufficiency head of household went to work, and then that money is in their escrow account. It's earning interest. The interest does not count as income for HUD. Um, and there are a couple of others here. Civil rights settlements, something that certain veterans with disabilities can get called aid and assistance or aid and attendant assistance, don't count as income. So you know where to find the list. So a quick question for you. Which one of the following does count as income for HUD programs? A, earned income tax credit refunds. B, earnings of a child under age 18. C, SSDI payments. Or D, earnings of a live-in aid. Only one of those is correct. So it's A, B, C, or D. Very good. Everybody's saying C, and C is correct. The other three were all on the list of excluded income. That doesn't count. Okay, check our time here. Okay, we're doing real well with time. I think what we'll do is take a break at 11 o'clock, if you can hang in there. All right, so there's some types of income that don't count. We've gone through a bunch of those. Then there are some mandatory income deductions, some amounts that are subtracted from income in the calculation. First, there is a deduction for each dependent in the family. And the dependent has to be either under age 18, except for a foster child who's not considered part of the family, um, or a person with a disability of any age, or a full-time student of any age. If any of those dependents, and it's usually going to be a child under age 18, lives in the family, then there's a deduction of $40 a month for each dependent. And when we get to the HUD rent calculator, you'll see how that works. You just have to enter the number of dependents, and the calculator will automatically deduct $40 a month from that. Now, HOTMA is going to be adjusting the dependent deduction for inflation going forward. And next, there is a deduction for elderly or disabled families. So an elderly or disabled family is a family in which the head of the household or their spouse or the only person in the household, if it's a one-person family, is either disabled or at least 62 years old. And this kind of highlights one of the problems with these public benefits is they can't even agree on who's old. Under Medicaid rules, a person is old or aged is the term they use. If they're 65, for SNAP, it's 60, and for HUD, it's 62. But if the head of household or their spouse or the only person in the household of the family is disabled or at least age 62, they get this deduction, which is currently $43.75 a month. Now, if there are multiple people in the household who are disabled or at least 62 years old, they don't get to multiply this deduction. It's a flat $43.75 a month, regardless of how many people in the household are disabled or at least 62. Okay. So that's the elderly or disabled family deduction. And the calculator, the rent calculator, will do that calculation for you as well. So, how does HUD define disability? Well, first, the easy part. If somebody meets Social Security's adult definition of disability, they are considered disabled under HUD rules. Suppose they don't. Then HUD regulations have a specific definition of disability that you'll find on slide 29 that has to do with having a longstanding disability that affects ability to live independently and that um, would be improved by more suitable housing. And then finally, there is the definition of developmental disability in the Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act. So HOTMA has already increased the deduction for elderly and disabled families. It used to be $33.33 a month. It's now up to $43.75 a month. And that's going to be increased for inflation um, annually, and it's going to be for an amount rounded down to the nearest $25 a year. One thing I should tell you about HUD programs is that they look at income on a different schedule than most benefits we deal with. With most benefits we deal with, they're looking at monthly income and monthly benefit amounts. With HUD programs, they're actually looking at annual income and adjusting it with annual deductions. And then they're taking the net amount and dividing that by 12 months to figure out monthly rent and utility payments. Okay. So what that tells you is under HUD rules, you're always averaging income over the year. So another deduction, another mandatory deduction is child care payments for a child who's under age 13 so that a household member can look for work, uh, further their education to pursue work, or to work or continue working. But the deduction for childcare that's needed for work can't be more than the amount of earnings that the worker in the family is receiving, um, which seems kind of reasonable. So if a family member goes to work and they're earning $1,000 a month and they claim that they're paying $1,100 a month for childcare, only $1,000 of it would be deductible, not more than the amount that they're earning from work. Now, HOTMA provides a temporary hardship exemption so that the child care deduction could continue even after the family member who's working or was working or is in education, if they stop work or stop education temporarily, they can still continue to deduct the child care. But it's only temporary and only in cases of hardship that they can show that they really can't afford that child care without the deduction. Now we've got a couple of kinds of deductions that are going to be especially useful for some people that we work with. There's a portion of disability related expenses and or medical expenses that can be deducted from income, but only the portion that's more than 10% of gross income. And for and it's only for households that are considered uh, disabled families or elderly families. Again, that's where the head of household, their spouse, or the co-head of household is disabled or at least 62 years old. Okay. Now, interestingly, well, actually, let me talk about reasonable attendant care and assistive technology costs that are paid for by the family to enable a family member with a disability to work. And those expenses can't exceed the amount of the earnings of the member with a disability who wants to work. So, um, I'm sorry, I don't think I stated that clearly. Let me say it again. So the family can deduct what they pay for attendant care and assistive technology costs that are needed by a family member with a disability. So either the family member with a disability or another family member can work. So, for example, a person with a disability needs to pay for attendant care or assistive technology so that they can work. That can be deducted. let's say the parent of an adult son or daughter with a disability wants to go to work, but they need to pay for attendant care and assistive technology for their adult son or daughter with a disability so that they're adequately cared for and safe in the home to enable the parent to go to work. That would also be considered deductible attended care and assistive technology costs. But the total cost can't be more, again, just like the previous slide, can't be more than the earnings of the family member or family members that were made possible by paying for the attended care and or assistive technology. Now, HUD has a somewhat broad definition of attendant care. I think most of us think of attendant care as hands-on assistance with activities of daily living, providing actual physical assistance to a person with a physical disability with activities of daily living. HUD's definition is broader than that. It includes home medical care, nursing services, housekeeping and errand services, interpreters for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, readers for people with visual disabilities. And it says here, not limited to these. So it could be broader kinds of expenses as well. So lots of disability related expenses can be considered attendant care and assistive technology costs. Okay. Now, I think I did not cover this. I think I kind of skipped over. Yeah, I'm back on slide 42 now, talking about health and medical expenses. So if the family is considered an elderly or a disabled family, meaning the head of household or their spouse or the co-head of household is disabled or at least 62 years old, then you can deduct the health and medical expenses for everyone in the family, not just the members who are disabled or at least age 62. And that's different from the SNAP rule, where you could only deduct medical expenses of family members who are disabled or old. Um, with HUD rules, you can deduct the medical expenses for everybody in the family if it's considered an elderly or disabled family. You can even deduct the medical expenses for people who are not disabled or at least 62. Now, this was a change that HOTMA has made that did not advantage tenants. It used to be that a family could deduct the medical expenses or attendant care or assistive technology costs that exceeded 3% of their gross income. Now that threshold under HOTMA is 10% of income. So that means less of those expenses can be deducted because it's only the amount above a higher threshold than it used to be. Okay. But HOTMA does provide a phase in for families that were already deducting medical expenses or attendant care and assistive technology costs before HOTMA took effect. And it will allow them to phase in that increase in the threshold. So it will allow them to deduct the expenses that exceed 5% for the first year and 7.5% the second year. But then it goes up to the 10% after year two. And also, there's a temporary hardship exemption under HOTMA for some families that would decrease the threshold from 10% to 5%, but only temporarily and only in cases of hardship. Now, PHAs are allowed to choose optional deductions. They can say, well, we want some additional deductions from income for our tenants. And they're allowed to do that under HUD rules, but only if they'll pay the cost. So if these optional deductions cause the PHA to bring in less rent income, they're going to have to pay the amount by which the rent income they received was reduced by the optional deductions. And as you can imagine, that means very few, if any, optional deductions are going to exist. Okay, I'm going to pause, see if you have any questions or comments. We're getting close to our break, about another 8 minutes. Any questions or comments? I'm going to look in the chat. Okay, not seeing anything from anyone. All right, we'll move ahead. So, self-employment earnings, as you would expect, do count as income. And the way they're counted is you take the business revenue, total money the business brings in, minus most business expenses. There are a few exceptions listed on slide 47, few kinds of business expenses that you probably wouldn't encounter anyway, typically with families you're working with or individuals. But most business expenses are deducted from self-employment income. Now, HOTMA is in the process, this has not taken effect yet, of implementing a new rule, a new financial criterion for HUD rental assistance programs, namely an asset limit. Before HOTMA, there was no asset limit at all for HUD programs. They would count the income on assets as income, but there was no limit on assets themselves. Under HOTMA, there is an asset limit, and once that's implemented, it'll be $103,200 for a family. That's going to be adjusted annually for inflation. And when I first looked at this, I thought, how many families getting HUD rental assistance have saved anywhere near $103,000? Probably very, very few, if any. So the asset limit is sufficiently high that it's probably not going to affect many families at all. And even if a family is being tested for the asset limit, when they initially sign up for a rental assistance program, they're not necessarily going to be tested for it in their re-examinations of eligibility, their redeterminations each year. The PHAs or the private project owners have the flexibility to say, nah, we're not even going to bother looking at assets after the first time. And there are certain types of assets that don't count against the limit: retirement accounts, real estate that can't legally be sold, settlements for actions that resulted in a family member's disability, um, personal property that's not considered necessary with a total value of under $51,600. And that's going to be adjusted annually for inflation. ABLE accounts don't count. Certain college savings plans, baby bonds, those family self-sufficiency, escrow accounts, of money in those. Irrevocable trusts will not count, like special needs trusts. And federal tax refunds don't count for 12 months, and a couple of others you're not likely to encounter. Now, some assets will generate income like interest or dividends, but other assets a family may not be getting any income on, sticking money under the mattress or something. Um, but if the asset is worth enough, if it's worth at least $51,600, even if the family isn't getting any income on it, what HUD rules say is they can count imputed income. They can say, well, if you stuck that money in a savings account and you got a little interest on it, you would get X amount of income. And they would count that imputed income, even though the family's not actually receiving any income on that asset. So, what does this say? It says the family should earn income on the asset. It's the amount of income that they actually get that will be counted as income. Okay, that $51,600 threshold is going to be adjusted annually for inflation once the asset limit takes effect. And the imputed income, when they say, well, if you stuck it in a savings account, this is how much income you would get. So we're going to count that as income, even though you didn't actually receive it. They're basing that this year on the passbook savings rate of 0.45% interest. Okay. If an asset is given away or it's sold at below market value and it's worth at least $1,000, it will still be counted as an asset for 2 years. Um, but again, this is really not going to be a big problem because of the high amount of the asset limit. Finally, and we will go through this point and then take a break. HOTMA will say that a family is not eligible for any kind of HUD rental assistance if they own a home that's suitable for them to live in. Well, own a home that's suitable for them to live in, they're probably not looking for rental assistance anyway. So this doesn't seem to be that big a hardship. Um, so there are some exceptions when they could own a home and still get HUD rental assistance, but there are just a handful of them you'll see on slide 55. And there may be various reasons that a home would not be considered suitable to live in, even if the family owns one. Like it's not accessible, and there's a family member with a disability. There is not a spare bedroom for live-in aid. The home is not close to accessible transportation, etc. All right, let's do this one last exercise and take a break. So, which one of the following statements is false? A, HUD programs had no asset limit before HOTMA, but have a $103,000, $103,200 asset limit in 2025 under HOTMA, or let's say will have an asset limit of that amount under HOTMA. B, interest and dividends received on assets generally count as income for HUD programs. And C, under HOTMA, a family usually qualifies for rental assistance, even if they own a house they can live in. So which one of those is not true? A, B, or C? Okay, very good. Everybody's saying C, and C is correct. Very good. All right. So let's take a break. When we come back, I'm going to walk you through the HUD rent calculator, and then you're going to be doing some examples using it, estimating what rent and utility amounts will be for particular families, um, given their changing circumstances, usually involving employment. But before we break, any questions or comments? Okay. Um, I've got about 2 minutes after 11. Let's take a 15-minute break, and I will see you at 11:17. Enjoy your break. Okay, we'll start in another minute. All right, welcome back. At this point, please go to the email that you should have received last night and download the attachment. It's the Excel spreadsheet and it's titled HUD Rent Calculator 2025. Make sure this is coming up clearly. I'm going to give you a minute to retrieve this document. This is your HUD rent calculator, and this is the best part of this training. I'm going to assume that everybody has it now. It's a simple Excel sheet. It's divided into several sections. It's got household members' income, pass exclusion. If a family member is using a plan to achieve self-support, this is where the pass expenses would be deducted. Standard deductions, we talked about those, the deduction for disabled or elderly families and for dependents. Then the disability expense and medical expense deduction, the attendant care and assistive technology costs, the health and medical expenses, the child care expense deduction we discussed. Near the bottom, it shows net income and tenant share of rent and utility costs, which would be 30% of the adjusted income. The utility allowance, if the family has one, is deducted on line 46. And then the tenant's net share of rent after subtracting the utility allowance, if any, is going to appear all the way at the bottom on line 47. So all of your data entry is going to go in column C. And this one is actually, I think, considerably easier to manage than the SNAP calculator. Calculation is not quite as complicated. So let's do a quick example. Feel free to follow along on your sheet as I'm doing it on mine, because you're going to be using this independently for, I think, 8 examples after this. So starting with household members' income, where it says monthly income source one, source two, etc., you can change that. You could type in SSDI, wages, whatever it might be, and then enter dollar amounts. Let's say that this is a two-person household and um, there's a parent with a disability and a young child, and the parent is getting $1,200 a month of SSDI, which you can put on line 3. It automatically enters a dollar sign. You don't need to. Then for wages, let's say that this parent started earning $1,300 a month. They're not using a pass. The parent is the head of household. They're disabled, obviously, if they're getting SSDI. So they get to use the disabled family deduction on line 15. Now, note the instructions there say eligible for disabled or elderly, age 62 or older, family deduction. If yes, enter 1. When you enter a 1 on line 15, column C, the spreadsheet automatically subtracts the deduction of $43.75 a month on line 16. Next, we've got number of dependents of the head of household living in the home who are under age 18, other than foster children, who are disabled in any age, or a full-time student in any age. So we've got one young child living in this household, so that's going to be a 1. And you're going to enter the number of dependents on line 18 in column C. In this case, it's 1. And what the spreadsheet does is deduct a dependent deduction of $40 on line 19. Now, just to show you what would happen if you had more than one dependent, let's say there were 3 dependents. If you had entered a 3, the dependent deduction would be $120, $40 per dependent times 3. But I'm going to keep that at 1 dependent in this example. Now we move on down to disability and medical expense deduction. Remember, it's only the amount that exceeds 10% of gross income. So the spreadsheet automatically calculates 10% of gross income on line 22. That's $250. The amount of the unreimbursed attendant care and assistive technology costs and medical expenses that can be deducted is going to be only the amount that exceeds that $250. So let's say that this parent is paying for attendant care expenses and assistive technology costs. Remember, attendant care is defined very broadly. Let's say they're paying for $200 a month for attendant care and assistive technology costs. We can put $200 on line 23. Then we go down to line 25, and this is the earnings made possible by the disability expenses. So what were the earnings for this person? Wages are $1,300. So you want to enter 1,300, the earnings that the expenses made possible, on line 25. And next, unreimbursed health and medical expenses. And because this is a disabled family, head of household is disabled, we can deduct any unreimbursed health and medical expenses for household or family members on this line. So not just the parent with a disability, not just their medical expenses, but also their non-disabled child's medical expenses. Say total medical expenses for this family are $300 a month on line 29. So what you'll see is the spreadsheet is taking the $200 of unreimbursed attendant care and assistive technology costs, adding the $300 of health and medical expenses, that's $500. It's subtracting 10% of the gross income, that $250 that the spreadsheet calculated on its own. And that leaves $250 of deductible attendant care, assistive technology, and medical expenses. And that appears on line 33. You didn't have to do that math. Next, we've got child care expense deduction. Let's assume that this parent is paying a relative a nominal amount to provide child care so that the parent can work. Let's say it's $150 a month. So we've got actually two separate lines. One is line 36 says unreimbursed child care paid for household member to work. The other is line 39, unreimbursed child care paid for a household member to seek work or participate in education to prepare for work. The calculation is a little different depending on which standard the child care meets. In this case, we're going to put it on line 36, unreimbursed child care paid for household member to work. So that's going to be line 36. We'll enter $150. Next line down, line 37, is earnings of household member made possible by child care. And once again, the parent with a disability is earning $1,300 a month gross wages. So we enter 1,300 on line 37. Okay. Now, let's say that this family was given a utility allowance of $120 a month. That's going to be on line 46, 120. And finally, on line 47, we'll see the amount of rent that this family pays to the landlord, $484.88. For something like this, you're going to round it. And you always, 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 when you use this calculator, tell individuals or families you're working with that these are estimates. These are not exact amounts that they're going to be paying. They're just estimates for informational purposes. Okay. So if this family did not have a utility allowance, what they would be paying for their rent, including all utilities, would be the amount on line 44, which is listed as tenant share of rent and utility costs, 30% of net income, and that's $604.88. Okay. And the utility allowance of 120 gets subtracted from that, leaving 484.88 approximately that the family would be paying the landlord. So once again, the utility allowance is based on the PHA's charts that estimate for a family of a particular size with a particular unit paying particular utilities. This is what they think they should be paying if they're paying a modest amount. Their usage for those utilities is fairly reasonable. What they actually pay for utilities is likely to be not exactly $120 a month. It'll be something less or something more, may fluctuate. But the assumption is that they're paying about $120 a month. And that's where the utility allowance comes from. Okay. So any questions about that rent calculator and how that works? Really pretty straightforward, but it does have a fair number of moving parts to it. So any questions about it? Okay. Then let's move on to some examples. So what I recommend that you do is go ahead and close out of the rent calculator you just entered data in, if you did. Um, don't save it, and then go ahead and reopen it again from the email, or if you've already downloaded it. So you'll have a clean sheet to start out with. And then we're going to go ahead and do these 8 exercises. So I'll give you a minute to get your fresh sheet ready. Okay. So, example one is Inez lives alone in an apartment she rents with a housing choice voucher. Her only income is an SSDI benefit of $1,680 a month. And to start out, she pays rent, including utilities, and her rent includes all utilities, of $490.88 a month. If you plug in the numbers on your HUD rent calculator, that's what you'll get. It takes the 1680 SSDI, subtracts the deduction for a disabled family of $43.75 a month. If there are no other deductions, then the spreadsheet takes 30% of that, and it's $490.88. Now, Inez starts a job earning $4,800 per month gross wages. And we're going to assume that Inez has not used up her trial work period, which means despite the fact that she's got quite substantial earnings from this job, she will still, for the time being, keep her SSDI payment. And what you want to do is use your calculator to estimate what her rent will be at her next redetermination, the next time they review her financial eligibility. So remember, there are just a few items you'll need to enter on your sheet. You've got two kinds of income. You put one on each line in the income section, her SSDI and her wages. And she's going to have that disabled family deduction. So you have to enter a 1 on the disabled family deduction line, and it'll automatically subtract $43.75 a month. And remember, you can change monthly income source one, source two, etc., to the actual types of income, namely SSDI and wages. And when you're finished and have an answer, please go ahead and type it into the chat. Okay. We have most people saying $1,930.88. Let's see what I had. $1,930.88. So let's just take a quick look at my calculator for this exercise, and you can compare what you did to what I did, just in case you got a different answer. So in the income section, SSDI of 1680, enlarge this a little bit. Wages, line 4, $4,800. And the eligible for disabled or elderly family deduction, that's line 15. You enter a 1 there. Your sheet should subtract $43.75. And that's it. And then on line 47 should be $1,930.88. Now, just a little foreshadowing here. Imagine that the unit that Inez is renting has a total rent, including utilities, of less than $1,930 a month. Excuse me. What then? We're going to talk about that a little later. That'll be one of the last things we cover today. Okay. Have anything else? Um, got it. Got it, Marilyn? Okay. Excellent. All right. So hold on to that sheet because now we're going to make a change and you can keep the existing sheet and then just make any changes rather than having to start all over from scratch. Um, and I recommend doing that. When you work with actual individuals or families, you may want to save this sheet with their name on it or somehow, some designation so you know this was completed for that family. And then when changes occurred to their situations, you can pull up the original calculator and make the adjustments. Okay. So next, example 2, Inez continues her job at the same earnings for over a year. After 12 months, her SSDI payment is suspended. So she had her 9-month trial work period plus the 3-month grace period. She's definitely doing substantial gainful activity with $4,800 a month of income. Extremely unlikely she'd have enough deductions, work incentive deductions, to get below the $1,620 a month SGA level. So she's doing SGA. After 12 months, her SSDI payment is suspended. How much will her rent be? Her rent includes utilities after this first year of work when her SSDI stops. Only need to make one change in that sheet and you'll get the answer to this one. And please go ahead and type it into the chat when you're ready. Michael, I think you meant 1426, but only one. Yeah, there it goes. Thanks. Okay. Can we get a couple more people taking a shot at this one? Great. Thank you very much. Great. So we've got consensus here, 1426 and change, or $1,426.88. That's what I got as well. All right. All you had to do was delete the SSDI amount, change that to 0. And that did it. Okay. So pretty straightforward. Now let's change to our next family. Example 3 is Leonid, who lives with his 16-year-old daughter, Olga, in an apartment they rent with a housing choice voucher. Leonid gets $1,054 a month of SSI. Olga has no income and is not disabled. The PHA gives Leonid a utility allowance of $150 a month. So how much should he pay for rent? So remember, we've got one source of income. We have a dependent, We have a disabled family deduction, and we have a utility allowance. So you're going to be entering $4 amounts on your sheet to get the answer to this one. And if you didn't do this already, I do recommend that rather than trying to go through the sheet and make sure you delete everything that you'd entered for Inez, just go ahead and close out the sheet you did for Inez and reopen a fresh sheet. The biggest problem I find with this calculator is when you go through it and forget to delete something from your previous calculations. Okay, we're getting some answers. Definitely need some more though. Okay, I wanted to ask if someone could, I can't minimize my screen because this is being recorded, so I can't send an email. But if someone could please email the sheet or just forward the email that I sent that had the sheet attached to Autumn. Oh, I'm sorry. Autumn, would you mind sending your message to the larger group? I'm sorry, but I can't send an email right now. So, Autumn, if you could put your message in the chat again with just your email address. Autumn needs someone to forward the email to her that has, thank you, Autumn, that has the spreadsheet on it so she can get into it. Thank you, Marilyn. Appreciate that. Okay, we've got some different answers to this one. Good. Learning experience. All right. Okay, we've got probably at least 5 different answers here. This is good. And what I got is $141.08 a month. Let's take a look at this. Incidentally, sometimes uh, the spreadsheet will somehow get corrupted, and you won't get the right answer even if you've entered everything correctly. And if you find that that happens, what you can do is just close out of it, open the sheet clean, and that should fix it. Um, so it's probably a good idea to always do this twice, just to make sure you get the right answer and that there's nothing wrong with your sheet. Okay, so here's what I did for Leonid and Olga. In the income section, I put SSI. It's 1,054 a month. In the second line, I still have wages because, as you would guess, in our next exercise, Leonid's going to be working. We've got eligible for disabled or elderly family deduction on line 15. Remember, you enter a 1 there, and it subtracts the $43.75 on line 16. Now we have one dependent who's under age 18. That's Olga. So we get a dependent deduction on line 18. You enter the number of dependents, it's 1, and the spreadsheet automatically subtracts $40. Then down toward the bottom, we've got a utility allowance of $150 on line 46. And if you entered all those amounts in the correct places, again, it's line 3, the SSI 1054, line 15, eligible for disabled or elderly family deduction, enter a 1 there. Line 18, number of dependents, enter a 1 there. And finally, utility allowance, line 46, $150. You should get $141 and change. Okay. Is there anybody not getting that if you enter those amounts on those lines? Okay. All right. Scott's going to protect formulas. Thank you, Scott. Not a bad idea. Okay. Great. Okay, now let's move on to our next example with Leonid and Olga. Example 4. Leonid starts a job and is paid an average of $867 a month gross wages. His SSI is reduced to an average of $663 a month. Nothing else has changed. How much should he pay for rent? Okay. Now, those of you familiar with SSI know that, well, wait a minute. SSI doesn't look at averages. SSI looks at actual month-to-month income, and you do the calculation monthly. This is true. However, remember when HUD rental assistance programs are involved, HUD rules take the income for the whole year, as well as the deductions, and then do averages. So it will work to do the average SSI amount in this case. So now you've got a changed SSI amount and an additional income amount for the wages. And then that should give you the correct answer. You don't have to make any other changes on the sheet so far. Okay, and please go ahead and enter your answer in the chat when you have one. Okay. All right, very good. So we've got consensus on $283 and or $283 and change. And that's what I got as well. Okay. Right. Very good. All right. Leonid's situation is going to change again. Leonid's and Olga's situation. Now we're up to example 5. You can keep the same sheet that you've been entering. We're still with Leonid and Olga. Leonid continues his job with the same earnings for 13 months. Olga is now 17 years old. She starts a job, is paid an average of $657 a month gross wages. Nothing else has changed. How much should Leonid pay for rent now? And you can type it into the chat when you're ready. Okay, very good. So, there's one key detail that you needed to remember for this one. It's fine if you didn't remember it because now you will. And that is, remember, earnings from work of a child under age 18 do not count as income for HUD programs. So although Olga is now bringing in $657 a month in gross wages from her, after school job, that doesn't count as income. And that means Landed's rent won't change. It'll still be the same amount, $283 a month and change. But don't cancel out your sheet yet because we've got another change coming up. Example 6, Leonid continues his job with the same earnings for over 2 years. Olga is now 18 years old. She's graduated from high school, is no longer a student, and she's not disabled. We had established earlier. She continues to be paid an average of $657 a month gross wages. Nothing else has changed. So how much should Leonid pay for rent now? This one's a little tricky. Okay, we've got several different answers here, which is great. Scott is saying not dependent. That's one of the keys. That's the one that most people usually forget. Olga is no longer meeting the definition of a dependent. And that definition is right there summarized on your calculation sheet. Okay, so most common answer here is $492 or so. And that's what I got as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up my sheet because this one had a couple of changes that are relevant. Okay. So with this one, we've got Leonid's income, his SSI of 663 a month, his wages of 867 a month, and now we add Olga's wages of 657 because she's now 18. She's no longer a child, and now her earnings from work do count if she's 18 or older. The disabled family deduction on line 15 stays the same. Enter the 1 there. But we no longer have the dependent deduction for Olga on line 18 because she no longer meets that definition of dependent. Still had the utility allowance on line 46 of 150 and the tenant's net share of rent on line 47, $492 and change. And I think it's fine to round these numbers because you're always going to present these to individuals as estimates anyway. If you put in dollars and cents, it's going to look like these are exact amounts. If you put in, estimates at least to the whole dollar, um, then those are going to be more easily understood as estimates and not exact figures. Right? And Stephanie found it. Great. Okay. Excellent. We've got one more family, two examples, and we'll be done with our HUD rent calculators for now. So, example 7 is Faustine and Carl. They live with their two children who are age 4 and 7 in public housing. Faustine has a disability, gets 1,054 a month SSI. Carl earns 1,300 a month gross wages. The children have no income. The family has a utility allowance of $220 a month. And you want to figure out about how much they should pay for rent currently. Okay, interesting. Everybody's in the same ballpark, but we're getting a little variation, which is good. Okay, looking for some more answers. Okay, now we've got a trend. Everybody's saying, well, I'm going to go with the most popular answer, picking a winner. I hope you don't vote that way, but anyway. So most popular answer here is $449 or $449 and change. That's what I got as well. So let me show you what my calculation looks like. So line 3, I put SSI 1,054. Line 4, I put Carl's wages. That's $1,300. We get the disabled family deduction because the head of household or spouse of the head of household or co-head of household is disabled. We don't know whether Faustine is considered the head of household or the co-head of household, but whichever, she's disabled, and therefore they count as a disabled family. And we enter a 1 on line 15. Two dependents under age 18. So for line 18, the number of dependents, we enter a 2. And the spreadsheet subtracts $80 on line 19. And then finally, we've got a utility allowance on line 46 of $220. And the tenant's net share of rent, line 47, $449 and change. Okay, so hold on to this. As you would guess, we're going to have one more change. Now, Faustine starts working and earns average gross wages of $1,950 a month. She pays $300 a month for attendant care to help her prepare for work. Her SSI is reduced to an average of $271.50 a month using IRWI. So those of you who might want to do the SSI calculation, remember the $300 a month attendant care that she's paying out of pocket can be used as an impairment related work expense in the SSI calculation. And that's how I got $271.50 a month for her SSI. She and Carl pay $250 a month for childcare so they can work. Nothing else has changed. how much rent should they pay now? One thing you don't want to forget is in addition to entering attendant care expenses and childcare expenses for work, have to remember below the lines where you enter those dollar amounts, you have to enter the amount of earnings that were made possible by those expenses. Otherwise, the spreadsheet won't calculate it correctly. This is our most complicated example, and this is the last one. Okay, and when you have an answer, please go ahead and type it into the chat. And this is not a test. This is just practice to get used to using this sheet. So there is no shame in getting a different answer than I got, because I will show you my sheet after everybody's had a chance to enter. Okay, Austin asks, does SSI amount get added into earnings made possible? No, good question. Thank you for asking, Austin. No, it's going to be just the earnings. So for the earnings made possible by Faustine's attendant care, the amount will be Faustine's earnings of $19.50 a month. The earnings that were made possible by the child care that Faustine and Carl pay for, that's going to be the total earnings between the two of them. Right. I give brownie points for bravery. I see that usually maybe the first, one of the first people or several of the first people to type in answers may not get the same answer that everyone else got, but you get brownie points for bravery. Um, so we've got most common answer here is 724 a month. That's what I got as well. Let's just take a quick look at my sheet and we'll be done with our exercises for now. Okay. So, so we changed the SSI amount on line 3 to 271.50. Carl's wages stay the same, 1,300. And we add Faustine's wages in the income section. I added them on line 5, and that's 1,950. We still have the disabled family deduction, line 15, should have a number 1. Still have the 2 young dependents, line 18 should have a 2. And then we get to the unreimbursed attendant care and assistive technology costs. That's line 23. That was $300 a month for the attendant care that Faustine is paying for so she can work. Earnings made possible by the disability expenses. That's going to be 1,950. That's going to be Faustine's earnings. Next down, we've got child care expense deduction, $250. On line 36. Now, line 37 says earnings of household member made possible by child care. I apologize. I forgot this when I told you earlier that you can add the two sets of earnings together, Carl's and Faustine's. Actually, that should have been um, the instructions for line 25, the earnings made possible by the disability expenses. If there had been more than one family member with a disability working, you could have added their wages together on line 25. For line 37, it's earnings of household member made possible by childcare, and it has to be only one. So I entered 1950, which was Faustine's earnings. In reality, the only thing that matters is that if the amount that was paid for the expense is less than the amount of earnings made possible by the expense, then the spreadsheet will work fine. It will deduct the full amount of the expense, but you do have to enter the earnings of household member made possible by the expense. Whatever you enter there, as long as it's more than the amount of the expense, the calculation will work. The utility allowance, line 46, is 220, and tenant's net share of rent, 724 and change. And wraps up our exercises. Any questions about that? Did I miss any? Um, Julia had asked which previous income was SSI. Uh, Not sure what you mean, Julia. If you could ask that differently, clarify, or come off mute. Um, Stephanie likes this one better than the Snap one. I wholeheartedly agree. This one's actually gotten easier when the earned income disregard existed. That complicated this a whole lot. That made the HUD rent calculator not nearly as popular. But this, um, and Scott actually thinks this one was fun. Congratulations, Scott. You're a you're a benefits nerd like me. So any questions about it? I have one question for you. Do you think you'll be able to use this with individuals or families who get HUD rental assistance to give them estimates of how great, great, yeah, how different levels of earnings or other changes may affect what they have to pay for rent and utilities? Yeah, yeah, that's the idea here is particularly with SNAP and HUD, because the calculation is complicated. I wanted you to have these spreadsheets. But when we're working with individuals who are considering different levels of earnings, they need to know what's the impact going to be on all the benefits, all the public benefits they get, and approximately how much net income will they have so that they can then make an informed choice about how much they want their earnings level to be, or if it's worth it for them to work a particular job. Gina says, yes, I have a gentleman I'm assisting now getting a new job, and he's concerned about his HUD. This resource is going to be amazing to help him visualize where his rent is going to land, as he's a very visual person and logic based. Excellent. Okay. So that's it for our exercises. Remember with the HUD rent calculation, what I recommend you do, same thing as with the SNAP calculation, is go through it line by line. Just go through each line. Some lines you'll skip, but if you go through it line by line, you're more likely to not miss anything important. Okay. And then you can save the sheet for a particular individual or family. And then when their circumstances change, somebody goes to work or their earnings change or a dependent turns 18, whatever it might be, certain expenses get added. You can pull it up, make the adjustment, and then save it again. Okay. We have a number of slides left, but we can go through these pretty quickly, and we will still finish by 12:30. All right, so minimum rents. I mentioned that in some programs, there are minimum rents so that even if the rent calculation shows that a family should be paying less, they may still be required to pay the minimum. But the maximum minimum rent for any of these programs is only $50 a month. And for some, it's $25 a month. So if there's a minimum rent and the rent calculator shows that the family should be paying less, they will typically still have to pay at least that minimum amount. But if there's a hardship, like somebody in the family um, the family lost all of their income, um, they can't afford to pay even the minimum amount, or they'd likely be evicted for non-payment of sufficient rent, that sort of thing. Um, there's a death in the family, then that would be a hardship, and they would not typically have to pay them even the minimum. They could pay the amount that the calculator says they should have to pay. Now, HUD has a big section about this. I'm going to summarize it very briefly. Ordinarily, when family income goes down, the amount of the total tenant payment, the amount that the family has to pay for rent and utilities, also goes down. This is usually true, including if a family has a reduction in income from welfare assistance, like temporary assistance to needy families, which we'll be covering in a future webinar. It's either TA or SNA, or I'm sorry, FA or SNA. Um, that's the program for low-income families with dependent children. And ordinarily, if those benefits get reduced or they stop, then the family's HUD rent will go down as well. That's logical. But there are exceptions. If the family committed fraud or a family member did not comply with a requirement in the welfare program to participate in an economic self-sufficiency program in work or work training or the like, then even though their income went down because their temporary assistance to needy families or uh, FA or SNA benefit, as it's called in New York, even though that went down, their rent would not go down. That's a penalty. But, only if they've committed fraud or they've failed to participate in a required program. And I am skipping through this to slide 86. So, the reexaminations of eligibility and rent amount for a family occur at least once a year if the family is paying income-based rent, if they're paying a rent based on generally 30% of their adjusted income. Okay. Now, each PHA has to have a policy on whether they require families to report changes or increases in their income that occur between their annual reexaminations, or whether they don't require that. They say, no, you can just wait until your annual reexamination to report that. Okay. What's the advantage of not having to report those interim increases in income? It means their rent won't go up until they get the annual reexamination. Okay. So if the PHA does require those interim increases in income to be reported, then the PHA has to do interim reexaminations when increases are reported. And that means the rent can go up more frequently than every 12 months. Because if, say, 6 months into their 12-month period, they have an increase in income, somebody goes to work or increases their hours or something like that. And if the PHA says that has to be reported, then the family has to report it, and then they'll get an interim reexamination, and their rent will be increased right away rather than at their annual reexamination. Now, what if the family's income goes down in between reexaminations? Well, then they don't want to wait for the next reexamination to have the next annual reexamination to have their rent adjusted. They want it to go down as soon as possible. And generally, when they have a decrease, a significant decrease in income, they can report that right away and request an interim reexamination to get their rent reduced. But Hot Hotma made a change to this, and you can tell that this one is to make life easier for the PHAs, not for the tenants, not for the families. What they said was um, under Hotma, interim reexaminations due to increases or decreases in income are only required if the change in income is at least 10%. Okay. And a PHA can say, well, even though a change, an interim change in income was reported, it was during the last 3 months of the 12-month certification period. And they can say, well, we're not going to do an interim reexamination. We're going to just wait for the annual date for that, just to make life easier for the PHA. Right. So if an interim change in income that's less than 10% occurs, that does not have to, that will not trigger a reexamination. The reexamination won't occur until the annual. Um, Now, an increase in earned income during the interim period between the annual redeterminations won't trigger an interim reexamination at all unless the family already had an interim reduction in their rent during the same 12-month period. Okay. So this one is good to know that increases in other kinds of income will trigger an interim redetermination, reexamination, and the rent would go up between the annuals. But if the increase in income is only from earned income, that won't trigger the interim reexamination, and the rent won't go up until the next annual reexamination. So that part is good. Okay, I think we'll move on here. Okay, so we're going to wrap up with two rules that can help families in public housing or housing choice vouchers keep their rental assistance, even if their income increases quite substantially. There's one rule that applies to public housing, a different rule that applies to the housing choice voucher. So let's talk about public housing first. So, as you've probably gathered, if a family's income-based rent, the rent calculated using our rent calculator and the usual rules based on a percentage of family income, um, if the income increases enough, then the amount that the rent calculator says that the family should be paying for rent and utilities could eventually end up being more than the market rate, more than the total rent and utilities for the unit that they're renting. And that hardly seems fair. In public housing, there's an option called flat rent. And every year, when a family in public housing gets a reexamination, they're given a choice of either having their income-based rent, generally 30% of their adjusted income, or a flat rent. And the flat rent is basically going to be, very, very much like the market rate for the rent and utilities for their unit. Okay. And they'll be given a choice. Here's what you'd have to pay for income-based rent based on your current income. Here's what you would have to pay for flat rent. And the family's obviously going to choose the option that gives them the lower rent. And for most families, that's going to be the income-based rent that the rent calculator estimates. But if their income increases enough that their income-based rent would actually be more than the market rent, then they can choose the flat rent and they will not have to pay more than the market rate to rent their apartment. Okay. So there's a logic to that. Flat rent is only an option in the public housing program. And I'm going to move on to the last issue, which is we're on slide 98 now, housing choice voucher income limit. Housing choice voucher is a little different. With the housing choice voucher, a family can remain eligible for their housing choice voucher so long as their income-based rent, the amount that they're paying, is less than the market rate, which means that HUD is paying for some of their rent and utility cost. Okay. So long as that's the case, the family can keep their housing choice voucher. Now, if their income goes up high enough that their total tenant payment ends up being the full cost of the rent and utilities for their unit, and HUD is no longer paying anything, then they can lose eligibility for their housing choice voucher. If that remains the case, HUD isn't paying anything for 6 months, 6 consecutive months, then the family will lose their housing choice voucher. But if their income goes down within 6 months and they end up paying less than the full cost and HUD funds are used again to pay some of it, then they could still keep the housing choice voucher. But if they go 6 months with income too high for HUD to have to pay anything, then they lose the housing choice voucher. So here's a tip. It's not going to work for every family, but it can work for some. If a family is looking at getting increases in income, particularly through employment, since that's what we're all about here, and it appears to you that their income-based rent may end up being more than the total rent for their unit, if you can anticipate that, what you can do is look at the market rent for the unit they're in and compare that to the payment standard. And HUD gives paperwork out that that would indicate what the payment standard is and what the gross rent is, the total rent for the unit. And you can see, okay, is the total rent for the unit that the family is renting less than the payment standard? If it is, the family can use this trick. Okay. So families paying a rent that on a unit that's got a gross rent of less than the payment standard, and 30% of their adjusted income can hit the total rent for their unit if it increases enough, and they could risk losing their housing choice voucher. But if they then find a unit with a higher rent, a higher gross rent or market rent that's equal to or greater than the um, the payment standard, then 30% of their adjusted income may very well be less than the gross rent or market rent for their rent and utilities for the new unit. In other words, if the regular rent, the gross rent for their unit is a little higher, that could mean that their income could be a little higher and they could still keep the housing choice voucher. They would need higher income before HUD would be paying zero. And that could, in some cases, enable them to keep the housing choice voucher with somewhat higher income. All right. So our last exercise, which one of the following statements is true? A, flat rents are an option for families in public housing or with housing choice vouchers. B, a family whose income increases may be more likely to keep their housing choice voucher if they live in a unit with a higher rent. Or C, a family in public housing can't be evicted due to income, even if they choose a flat rent. Now, I apologize. I was rushing to get through the last few slides, and I'm just going to tell you this one. The correct answer is C. Um, I'm sorry, no, correct answer is not C, because a family in public housing can be evicted if their income is too high for an extended period. If it's at least 120% of the median income for a period of time, they can actually be evicted. So C is not true. But which of the other two options, A or B, is true? You can put that in the chat, A or B. Yeah, people are saying B, and that's correct. A family whose income increases may be more likely to keep their housing choice voucher if they live in a unit with a higher rent or they move to a unit with a higher rent. That wraps up our training for today. The resources I promised you that all come from HUD, you'll find on slides 103, 104, 105. And just so you know it exists, the other handout that I attached to that email I sent you is called Comparison of Rental Assistance Programs Chart. And this one goes through 16 different rental assistance programs and provides lots of information about each of them. So you can look those up if you're encountering other kinds of rental assistance programs than the ones that we've covered. Okay. Um, and Jeffrey asked, could you get an email of the PowerPoint? You didn't get that. Okay, Jeffrey, if you could just send me your email, you can just send that to me directly. I can go ahead and email that because I will stop the recording now and then I can minimize my screen. So thank you all for participating. Hope to see you again for our last remaining webinars on other benefits. And Thanks again.